Today, dear friends, we're going to look at the question of the magisterium, or if you want, the teaching office of the church. I think it's important for us to try and understand this so we can grasp the necessary distinctions that we need to make when we look at the present situation in the church. So firstly, what then is the magisterium? By the magisterium, we refer to the teaching office of the church, without any specific reference to any particular person or age. We're referring to an office that is bequeathed to the church by which it rightly teaches those truths which are necessary for salvation. However, when we look or speak about the question of the living magisterium, here we are speaking primarily of those who at any stage or time in history are exercising the office of teaching in the church, and this normally is done by the Pope and the bishops in their teaching capacity as the legitimate successors of the apostles. We do need to then examine this question of the magisterium in order to understand its limitations and regards to what it deals with, and to grasp what its scope is. Hence, when we speak of the magisterium, keep in mind that what we previously said, that not all that the Pope teaches is infallible, and so this being the case, not every exercise of his teaching authority is binding in an absolute sense. Hence, when we speak of the ordinary magisterium, we are speaking of the ordinary exercise of the Pope's office as teacher. This magisterial authority then is called the ordinary magisterium. However, there is also what we call the extraordinary magisterium, and this refers to those times when in a general council the Pope defines or ratifies a doctrine that he intends to bind upon the whole church. And so, in short, the magisterium refers to the voice of the church echoing the same message throughout the ages, even if there be a living voice that is exercising it at any given time in history. The ordinary and universal magisterium is what is carried out on a daily basis through the continuous preaching of the church to all the people. And this includes four aspects. If we're going to look at this, firstly, the preaching and the proclamations of the corporate body of the bishops. Secondly, the universal custom or practice associated with dogma. And thirdly, the consensus or agreement of the church fathers and theologians. And fourthly, from a lesser aspect, nevertheless still important, the common or general understanding of the faithful. And this aspect we'll come back to some more details later, but today we're just going to give you a brief understanding of what we mean by these 4 points. As regards, firstly, the preaching and proclamation of the corporate body of bishops, here is to be understood that the bishops preaching throughout the world, but with the Roman Pontiff, form one corporate body. Together they are infallible when declaring a teaching on faithful morals. Secondly, as regards the practice of the church associated with dogma, that is the customs and things. Among the customs and practices which have been closely joined to dogma, we mention especially the public rites used in the solemn celebration of the sacrifice of the Mass or the administration of the sacraments, also the formulas of prayers and various feasts or offices instituted by the church, or sacred practices which have been associated with doctrine. For a practice of the church to become a criterion of faith, there are two requirements. Firstly, that the practice be necessarily connected with dogma or dogmatic truth. For in imposing a practical or practice or custom, the church, by that very fact, orders that dogmas connected with this practice must be adhered to. And secondly, that a custom of this kind be universal or approved at least tacitly by the infallible authority. The third point, as regards the agreement of the church fathers and theologians, and this point is quite important for us to understand that. But who are we talking about firstly when we speak about the church fathers? It's not your local priest. It's those great minds of antiquity. They are The fathers are those men who were distinguished for their sanctity and their doctrine, who in the first centuries of the church made the church renowned by their writings, and who received full approbation from the church, or at least in an implicit manner. The church teaches then that the fathers of the church speak as witnesses of the church when they teach that a doctrine has been revealed or has been accepted by the universal church, or that a doctrine must be so held that it cannot be denied without the loss of faith, or cannot be called into doubt. Similarly, they speak as witnesses to the faith when they assert that a contrary opinion is heretical or opposed to the Word of God. The rules to be followed here are that the morally unanimous agreement of the Fathers declaring that a doctrine is de fide is a certain argument of divine tradition. 3 conditions are necessary that an argument be considered certain: that it is related to a doctrine pertaining to the faith or morals, that the testimony be free of doubt, and that it be firm, that the church fathers declared positively that the doctrine is a doctrine of the church. It is this way that the faith or the belief of the universal church can be certainly known. Secondly, the testimony of one father or many fathers in matters of faith or morals is a probable argument, the force of which increases as the number and the authority of the fathers increase. Thirdly, when the fathers disagree, when the church fathers disagree, their authority offers no firm argument. Rather, it proves that the matter on hand has not been explicitly defined, for if a matter had been clearly defined, then the fathers could not have defended the contrary opinion without being condemned by the church as heretics. If the disagreement is manifest, we must confess that the certain fathers have erred, for as individuals they are fallible, they are limited. In every case, their words must be treated with respect. We must not attribute error to them because they did not have the knowledge of more explicit definitions as time progressed, and we'll look at this question later on. The authority of the theologians, that is, the great minds of the church, that many of them have been given this title, Doctor of the Church, like St. Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, and others. The theologians of the church can be considered as witnesses of the faith. In regard to their authority, the following rules are set forth by the church. When theologians unanimously teach that something is not only true, but that it must be accepted in the Catholic faith, such consensus on their part presents a certain argument. If all proclaim that some doctrine in regard to the faith and morals as true or certain, it must be said to be rash to reject this doctrine. If there is a division of opinion amongst the different schools, even if the theologians of one school hold their opinion as certain or another one very close to the faith, no obligation exists of accepting such opinion as de fide, but we cannot just ignore such an opinion or see that go against it very lightly. The common understanding of the faithful, and what's meant by this? What the church understands by this is that the real doctrine can be discovered not only among the clergy, but also among the faithful who, with a common or general understanding, profess a unanimous faith. Now, in order that this common understanding be a criterion of revelation, it must be 1. Certain and clear, 2. Unanimous, and thirdly, concerned with important matters of faith and morals. So in short, I've given you some of the basic distinctions and understanding things that impose themselves on the Magisterium, the voice of the church, in order for us to begin to understand clearly that this teaching authority is very limited in its scope, and it's limited primarily to faith and morals, as we said before, but also that those who exercise this authority can err, and I insist on that. They can err when they're not speaking on matters of faith or morals, in which they intend to bind the faithful. And here I just want to quote, I'm going to quote several theologians, but I'll just quote 2 more important ones. Father Herder, a Jesuit, who was a well-known qualified member of the Spanish Inquisition, and his theological dogmatic manual points out that If grave and solid reasons, above all theological ones, present themselves to the mind of the faithful against decisions of the authentic magisterium, either episcopal or pontifical, it will be licit for him to fear error, assent conditionally, or even to suspend assent. Why? Because the ordinary magisterium can err when it's not being used in an extraordinary way. So, again, I quote the famous manual of Dein Kampf, non-infallible acts of the magisterium of the Roman pontiff do not demand an absolute and definitive subjection. The obligation to adhere to them could begin to cease in the case when a man capable of judging the question after a very diligent and painstaking analysis of all the reasons arrives at the conviction that error was introduced into the decision. Now, I will add on this point that it's very clear also after the papal definition of infallibility by Vatican I, it was very clear in the mind of the Church that this question of infallibility referred to dogmatic facts and not necessarily to the Church's discipline or things proposed by the ordinary non-infallible magisterium. This point here is very important as we confront this, to look at the question of resisting a pope. But with all that I've said, I think there's obviously going to be some important objections, and one of the most common objection is to all this, and it's a fair objection, and we want to look at it somewhat in our next talk, and that is, who is it that interprets the ancient faith? Isn't it the living magisterium, the present cardinals, bishops, pope? Aren't they the ones who tell us how to understand the tradition of the past? And if that's the case, then on what basis do we dare oppose them by appealing to tradition? Well, we're going to look at this in more detail in my next talk. I just want to conclude today's talk with the words of a well-known layman, Dietrich von Hildebrand, who was a famous German Catholic philosopher and theologian who Pius XII called the great 20th century doctor of the church. And even though he's certainly not a doctor of the church, what he points out here in this statement is quite important for us to grasp. He says that loyalty towards the Holy Father, which is nobly intended, but in which practical decisions of the Pope are accepted in the same way as ex cathedra definitions or encyclicals dealing with questions of faith or morals, which are always in full harmony with the tradition of the Church and the Magisterium. He says this loyalty is really false and unfounded. It places insoluble problems before the faithful in regard to the history of the Church. In the end, this false loyalty can only endanger the true Catholic faith. And it is this danger, dear friends, that we must be aware of when we try to respectfully confront and oppose the erroneous ideas that we can see have infected the mindset of the present hierarchy. And so this is my thoughts for you today on the question of the Magisterium.